I'm actually a stand-in for Andrew Kimbrell, who was going to give this talk. And I think that's important. I was hoping to meet him. It's one of the exciting things about coming to a conference like this. But I'll try and give you a little bit of background as he would have. And I think it's appropriate that someone like him was scheduled to do this, because as I'll try to point out at the end, I think that the kind of work that people like him are doing is critical to our success long term. What this quick intro is supposed to be about is the connection between patenting of life and the rise of the what we call the big Macs in the seed industry, the multinational agricultural chemical companies, because as I'm sure many of you realize, the seed business has fallen more and more under the financial control of the what I would basically call the input sector of the ag industry, and that on a cash basis is largely in the control of the large multinational chemical companies now. That term was come up with by Bill Freeberg of Seed and Crops Digest, a very interesting magazine in the industry. And I'm of the belief myself that there is this very, very close connection between the ability to patent, in our case especially, plants, plant parts, and the plant genome itself. And so I want to quickly go over the development of the regulatory basis of plant patenting, so that we can see how it has come to be one of the important supports of this system that we here believe is decreasing diversity and security in the food system. So quickly, there is a background to this that I'm not going to cover, and that is well covered in a number of books. I especially like the ones by Pat Mooney and Cary Fowler, Shattering Cary's, I'm forgetting, Shattering is Pat Mooney and Cary Fowler, and Cary Fowler's is, I've forgotten the name. Point is, they've done some very good work on how this is all based on the changing of agriculture from a self-sustaining operation to an operation dependent on inputs and outputs, and that the commodification of the inputs really transformed agriculture from more of an art to more of an economy. It's what caused it to become agribusiness, and that the seed business is clearly, indicative of this trend. And I can't really deal with that, but keep in mind that that's behind this whole drive to the what you might call the economization of agriculture. The idea of protecting intellectual property, which is what patents do. They protect not ideas themselves, but the results of ideas. And that's been around for a long time. As early as the 7th century BC in Greece, there was a protection for people's recipes. In Venice in the 1400s, there were what you might call proto-patents, 1600s in England. In 1790, Thomas Jefferson proposed that there should be a legal protection for the results of ideas in patents in the U.S. Jefferson, as we all know, was very interested in horticulture and agriculture, and in proposing that, he proposed right then that it should not apply to plants, with the implication of living things generally. And for a long time there wasn't, but in the 30s, in the nursery business, which I used to be in myself, there was an explosion of essentially vegetatively reproduced plants. Think about geraniums, think about fruit trees, think about African violets, all of those kinds of things. And those are very easily reproduced by anyone, and so the larger operators in that wanted to have protection, and they got a piece of legislation after a lot of discussion with the USDA, which was against it, and the Patent Office, which was against it. They got a certain intellectual protection for what were essentially found objects, and that's one of the key elements that becomes important in the development later on, is the Plant Protection Act, which was passed in the 30s, really protected clonally or vegetatively reproduced plants, and it didn't require that these plants be anything that you personally invented. And when we normally think of patents, we think of the necessity of it being a novel invention that wouldn't exist without the input of humans. That's not true of the Plant Patent Act, which was very clearly restricted by Congress not to include sexually reproduced plants, which is to say not to include anything that was seed done. Yes? This was U.S. only, yes. I'll talk briefly about international ones in a moment. This was the U.S. Plant Patent Act. There were similar kinds of patent legislations in Europe, but not applying to plants until the 60s. And this one applied only to vegetatively reproduced plants. This is like Starks Brothers apple trees, which are not grown from seed, they're grown from cuttings. And so there's a very clear stability in the thing that's being patented. And I want to talk about that briefly in a moment when we get to the actual point where patents were starting to be issued. Because the patenting requires novelty, and it requires complete description, and it requires disclosure. And this Plant Patent Act of the clonally things didn't require that it be a novel thing. It only required that it be a stable thing and that you discovered it. And it also didn't require that you disclose where you discovered it or how you got it. And those are important distinctions that become important later on. But Congress very clearly excluded sexually reproduced plants from that legislation. And there was a lot of testimony about that has been documented very well. In the 60s in Europe, they came up with an international treaty called UPOV, Union on the Protection of Varieties, I believe, and that took this concept a little further and did apply it to sexually reproduced plants. It did have a couple of other, at first, protections in it. It did protect the what was then called the right of farmers to save seed and replant. It also protected what was called the right of breeders, public and private, to use other people's protected material in developing new plants. And that was really important because the whole concept of patenting back to Jefferson and before was that if you allowed a person to protect their intellectual property, as Jill said, I've written a number of books, and I'm sure glad that they're copyrighted because it provides me with a good $700, $800 a year that I can certainly use. And I did put a lot of time into writing them. So some sort of intellectual protection is something that I think is generally accepted. The question is, does it fulfill the original intent, which is to spur innovation, or does it inhibit innovation? And when applied eventually to things like the genome, the genomic commons, the natural resource commons, does it increase the stability and diversity of that system, or does it decrease the stability and diversity of that system? So while we might agree that there is an inherent sort of benefit to some sort of intellectual protection, we have to see what larger implications it has. Well, with the UPOV, there was essential protection for those elements built in the beginning. However, one of the first things that came out of it was this question of how do you decide what is what. And anybody who's fiddled around with seed saving of heirlooms knows how commonly some things will exist under 5 or 6 names, and every breeder knows this, of course. They unfortunately took a draconian way of dealing with this and created what was called the Common Catalog, which was an agreed-upon regulatory list of established varieties of plants. And the problem is that this list was put together in a fashion that really benefited the promulgators of commercial varieties and dropped off the back an enormous number of potentially valuable varieties that might have one trait or another trait that was useful, but that wasn't particularly commercially valuable. And it made it illegal to sell those varieties in the trade, which limited the diversity available in the commercial sector fairly quickly. And the Europeans who were active in this issue are still screaming and crying about this, and as well they should be. Now, Later on, about another 10 years later, the U.S. Followed suit with an upgrade to the PPA, which was called the PVPA, which they actually set it up separately because there were all sorts of competing industry interests here that we don't have time to discuss, and those of us who exist within that private sector hear entirely too much about it at our meetings anyway. The PVPA was set up to cover this question of sexually reproduced plants, which then covers an enormous number of our food crops. The PPA back in the 30s was mostly about ornamental plants and small-scale food crops, but the PVPA started talking about the stuff that we're really dependent on for our diets. And it basically had the same provisions as the UPOV, with the breeder's exception and the farmer's right to save seed. It was still called a right at that point. But it too was revamped later on to remove these kinds of things. In its case, it was revamped in '94 and severely restricted these kinds of rights and actually changed them to be called privileges, which, as we all know from the progression of language that we've seen in the past couple of years politically, when the language starts to change, you know they're about to try and do something to you. And in this case, it was no longer a farmer's right, but a farmer's privilege. And that started what I would think of as a slippery slope towards even more restrictive forms of intellectual property. A number of the elements of that, as well as being made more restrictive, eventually were brought into agreement with UPOV so that we could join UPOV, since that was international. And a large part of the strategy behind this from the industry perspective was to open up the world trade for the purposes of approaching the globalization that we're all here and talking about. If you can't have an agreement among statutes in different countries, you can't have globalization. That's an issue that we deal with in 20 different venues at a conference like this. So things went along like this. The industry, actually, the American Seed Trade Association actually was able to write that law in draft form and then have it tinkered with and put through. And there were some industry complaints, again, that we won't go through between different segments of the industry. But it marked a new phase in the seed industry, because it was when the seed industry in its official function became very politically involved, and it has been since then. I can tell you every ASTA meeting I go to now has very extensive meetings on congressional relations, and of course I always make sure that I sit in the biotechnology committee meetings. And it's very interesting to see how aggressive the ASTA has become compared to what the historical record of it was. Now, things really took a turn to more restrictive and more protective regulation in 1980, and I find it kind of ironic, because on the surface, the development that was granted the first patent on life was actually a very positive development from some views. It was a microorganism that could consume oil and was designed to be used to clean up waste dumps and to clean up oil spills and things like that. Now, from the most extreme perspective that we hold in our group, of course, this is only a symptomatic cleanup of a larger problem that shouldn't have been allowed to develop in the first place. But within the context of an oil-consuming society, it's actually kind of a nice invention to have some way to clean up the oil spills. Unfortunately, that little benefit was used as a way to open the door to patenting life. And as soon as this particular crack was opened, the companies rushed in and used this as an example of how life was essentially no different than other novel inventions. In this case, it was actually a utility patent that was issued. And there was a lot of court work going up to this, and it was pretty much done without much public input. And what really made the distinction was the industry, people who wanted to get intellectual property control over life, realized that the courts were a better venue for them all of a sudden, because they could pursue the acquisition of the kinds of rights and property rights they wanted without any public input by using the lawyers and the forums of the court. And the Patent Office had previously been rejecting applications for patent life because they were not considered to be inventions. In this case, because it was a very small organism and it had been created by Chakrabarty, and this became the name of the case, they were able to make this intellectual distinction. Well, this intellectual distinction was then blown wide open, and the PTO started issuing patents in volume in 1985. One of the patents that was issued went to Pioneer Hybrid, which was the genesis of another court case that was decided in December 10th, 2001, I believe. And this one has an irony for me too, because the court case itself wasn't actually about GMOs. It wasn't about the breeding. It wasn't about the genomic ownership. It was because somebody who was a seed discounter bought a bunch of seed from Hybrid and took it and was discounting it to farmers, even though he wasn't a Pioneer Hybrid dealer. And Pioneer Hybrid took them to court saying, you can't do this because we own the rights to this variety, and you can't sell it unless you're one of our dealers. It was nothing about any of the issues that we care about. It was about pure dollars and cents and control of the marketplace. Now, actually, the irony of it is that is what we're about. And that is what the whole thing is about. Because in the end, what this meant when this happened was that it showed the underbelly of the patenting issue, because the patenting issue is that if you can control the marketplace by not allowing competitors to come in and develop things that compete with your products, then you're able to control the market and build the kinds of profits that Wall Street wants, instead of what we in the agricultural sector are traditionally used to. And when that becomes possible, you have a flood of Wall Street money coming in, you have enormous amounts of research capability going into the genome, and you have the rise of the biotech industry. You also, by using the utility patents, instead of the PPA, which was for whole plants, and the PVPA, which was for recognized sexually born varieties, which essentially means genetic constructs. In other words, the whole set of characteristics that define red salad bowl lettuce from green salad bowl lettuce, for example. What you had when you started using utility patents, which is what the Chakrabarty decision opened up, and what the Farm Advantage, as it's called, decision, even though it was about economics, confirmed, was that you're able to basically patent any DNA situation, sequence, process, any of those kinds of things. That causes a much bigger problem, because if you have a patent on a DNA sequence that is common to a large number of plants, then you have the ability for people to legally patent large numbers of plants within a species. For instance, there are people who claim that they have patents on the entire range of GMO soybeans. They've been thrown out now, but they were able to try and make that claim. The reason that this got through is a matter of concern to a lot of us, and of course there's great belief that the first patent argument in 1980 passed only by 5-4 at the Supreme Court. The Farm Advantage one in 2001 passed 6-2. A lot of people were put onto the Supreme Court in that period of time. And what that means is what I mentioned briefly before, which is the courts have become more of a medium of both corporate and anti-corporate activism than they previously were. Previously it was public opinion, and it was the Congress, and it was places like that where these battles were fought. And now these battles are being increasingly fought in the courts. Hence the importance of somebody like Andrew, who is a lawyer who pursues things in these media. There are a lot of people who would say that the reason this issue went that way, the Supreme Court specifically rejected the entire congressional history of exclusion of sexually reproduced plants from the original legislation and the protection of breeders' rights and farmers' rights in the second legislation. And there are a lot of people who would say that that was done specifically because 1,800 patents had already been issued. And to give a negative ruling there would have cut the heart out of those 1,800 patents. Now, from our perspective, that's precisely where the power lies when you think about it. Because those of you who might have been involved in the nuclear power issues over the years realize that one of the keys to the success of nuclear power in the United States was a thing called the Price-Anderson Act. And the reason that was a key is because it limited the liability of the companies that own the nuclear power plants and set the public to pick up the rest of the bill if there was ever a problem. That was the sole thing that made nuclear power plants economic and possible for the investment to come into them. If you didn't have Price-Anderson, you wouldn't have the investment in nuclear power. If you didn't have patenting of life under utility patents, you wouldn't have GMOs, because you wouldn't have the investment capital to develop the kinds of programs that Monsanto does that then requires them to have the market share to pay back that investment, that then requires them to run up huge percentages of the acreage, which then limits the diversity of our major crop foods, our major crop lines. And anyone who has the slightest belief that people like Monsanto, who doesn't now, should have control over our food system only needs to look briefly at how they ran their own business and the trouble they got into. Because they basically barely exist anymore because they made a number of very, how many more minutes? 3 minutes. A number of very, very stupid business decisions. Those of us in the seed industry watch these decisions be made, watch them overpay for 3 or 4 companies because of bad decisions, and there is absolutely no reason that we would want to turn over the food system that we depend on to people who are no better managers than that. So it's my opinion, and I think you should keep this in mind when you're thinking about the kinds of actions to take, that if we can cut out the patenting of life, we cut out the financial heart of what we call the Big Macs, the multinational agricultural chemical companies. They will go elsewhere for their profits if we take out the patenting of life, because that's the only way they're ever going to get the returns that the venture capitalists that are funding them require. And that makes it a very, very necessary approach for us to take. We have to also work in forums like Congress to make sure that there is legislation that is so clear that people that are beholden to the financial interests of these things can't ignore the congressional intent and use the courts to further the agenda, because it's going to be a long time before we get the courts back after all of the time that we've had these kinds of justices like Clarence Thomas, who wrote that opinion, in there changing the law to their benefit in complete ignorance of what Congress intended. Finally, what I want to say is that it's important when we do these things to keep in mind what the real issues here are. And the real issues, in a forum like this, we hear an enormous amount about smash the capitalist system, and I certainly think that multinational corporate capitalism is a real problem. I also, having spent some time in Eastern Europe, think that multinational industrial socialism is a huge problem. I think that capitalism and socialism both have developed into very, very hypocritical systems that pay absolutely no attention to their founding documents. And the reason I make that distinction is because what we're really against here, if you think about it, first and foremost, is the industrial metaphor, okay? The Soviet Union, they may have rejected capitalism, but they took the industrial metaphor big time. And their farming got even worse than ours, got even bigger than ours, got even more specialized than ours, got even more segmented than ours, destroyed their global farmer knowledge perspective worse than we did in every possible way, because they didn't have democratic feedback like we do. Either of these systems will drive us to ruin environmentally if it follows the industrial metaphor. And the industrial metaphor involves commodification, it involves mass producing, and it involves mass distribution. Those things are all inherently disastrous to diversity and stability in natural systems. They apply perfectly well to gadgets and widgets, but they don't apply very well to natural systems because they cut out the diversity that confers stability. And so keep in mind when we're having our socio-political discussions that when we're talking about agriculture and the environment, we want to talk about the industrial metaphor versus the personal metaphor or the diverse metaphor, and then we can also talk about ownership questions. But the questions of scale and the industrial metaphor transcend the ownership issue. They're even more central to the problem than the ownership issue, which is very, very important. But both forms of ownership have destroyed the earth by buying into that first and more core issue, which is the industrial metaphor. So I would like to have us keep that in mind, and I would like to have us stop the patenting on life, because that is the key money provider, and it requires the industrial metaphor, because the amount of money that is invested in these things then requires things to be done on such a scale that they only work in an industrial way. Therefore, we have a closed loop of destruction of diversity, and it's ultimately unsustainable. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I'd like to thank Jill and all the other organizers for bringing me here to Missoula. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor for me to come and bring you a message what now has happened, not what could happen or may happen, but what has happened in the biotech industry, and especially in regards to farmers. I'll just give you a brief introduction of myself. I'm from Western Canada, near the city of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, and I've been farming since 1947, and primarily a farmer in canola and wheat. And I'm also known in Western Canada as a canola developer, or a seed developer, and a seed saver, where I was using my seed from year to year. Now, I want to get immediately into what happened to me, and basically I'll do it briefly, is that Monsanto laid a lawsuit against me in 1998, and in that lawsuit they said this: I had obtained their seed illegally, without a license from them, without paying their technology charge, seeded it, and therefore I infringed on their patent. I had never, ever, nothing to do with Monsanto. I never bought their seed. I never even went to a meeting of Monsanto, never even knew a Monsanto rep. So my wife and I stood up to Monsanto and said, if indeed some of your GMO seed is in my developed seed, then you are guilty, and you should have a liability issue here and against you for destroying my seed. So it went to trial after 2.5 years, but in pre-trial, Monsanto withdrew all the allegations against me, and they said they were false allegations, that I had ever obtained their seed illegally. But they said it did not matter that I did not buy the seed. What mattered was, it didn't matter how it got into my field. I violated their patent. And after 2.5 weeks of trial, Federal Court of Canada, this is what the judge ruled. After 10 months, we waited for his decision. He said, it doesn't matter how it gets into a farmer's field. And he went so far as to specify cross-pollination, direct seed movement, wind, birds, bees, you name it. It doesn't matter how it gets there. You will violate Monsanto's patent. He also ruled, in cross-pollination, if any farmer or anyone has a plant or a seed and it gets cross-pollinated against your wishes, destroying your property, it becomes Monsanto's property. He also ruled that I could not use my seed again. All my developed seed of a half a century. And even from some of my fields where tests showed there was no contamination of Monsanto's canola in mine, he ruled I could not even use that because I was a seed saver and using my own seed, there was a probability there could be some of Monsanto's seed in my seed. So it ruled out I could not use my seed again. Now, what it is all about is property rights. The property rights of farmers versus intellectual property rights of multinational. My rights were taken away. My right to grow a crop of canola was taken away. My choice was taken away. Monsanto would say, well, the farmer has choice. You do not have a choice anymore because your rights are taken away based on what the judge ruled. He ruled that patent law is over and above farmers' rights or farmers' privileges, period. It was a strict case of patent law. The issue of property rights and the issue of liability, when it was brought up in court, said this. The judge said, that is an issue for another court. We're here to address patent infringement. Now, why did farmers in 1996 in Western Canada grow GMO canola? Across the border into North Dakota, Montana, Minnesota, why did they grow GMO soybeans? And farmers were told a few basic things. Number one, it was a bigger yielder. more nutritious, but most of all, less chemical use. And after 3 and 4 years, what did we find out? It wasn't. We were really naive. We should have never listened to it. It was a poorer yielder. It was not more nutritious. And most of all, we're now using 6 to 10 times, on average, more chemicals than ever because it has become a superweed. The genes, the GMO genes from another number of companies are all now in one canola plant, which takes a multitude of chemicals to try and kill it. Now we're looking at GMO wheat. They're trying to bring in GMO wheat, and we're hearing the same things again. A bigger yielder, more nutritious, and less chemicals. So it's exactly the same thing is going to happen to us again. The other part is this, and I've told this to farmers all over the world, and I've told governments where I have been invited to speak out. There is no such thing as coexistence. You can't have GMOs into the environment, a life-giving form, and have organic farmers or conventional farmers, because GMOs will take over because it's the dominant gene. So there is no such thing as coexistence. There is no such thing as containment. Once you put a life-giving form like a gene out into the environment, you cannot contain it. It will spread. And when they said will leave a buffer strip or so many miles or so many feet, it will spread because pollen doesn't only flow with the wind. It can brush off on the fur of an animal, on the feathers of a bird, or flow on water and go many, many miles. There is no such thing as containment. The only reason, to me, for a test plot is just to contaminate the seeds and the soil, so then there is no turning back. That's the only reason for the test plots. So there is no such thing as containment, and there's no such thing as coexistence. It's either GMOs or it's either organic farmers or conventional farmers. So then there's the whole economic issue. We have basically destroyed the canola industry of North America because we no longer can sell our canola to many countries of the world, and including most of all the European common market. Then we have, as I said, the liability issue. Who is liable if a farmer grows a GMO canola or a GMO soybean and it contaminates and destroys your neighbor's crop? Like in my case, my neighbor grew it in 1996 and destroyed my pure seed. Who is liable? So now we have a liability issue. There are many other issues that come out of this. My issue, as I said, is the property rights issue versus the intellectual property rights of multinationals. I think the second part is the issue of how the danger and the safety of our food versus GMO food. And the third issue, the damage to our environment. But I think another really important issue is the control and suppression of people through the contracts and the patent law. And in the United States with the Pinkerton Detective Service, in Canada with the Robinson investigation, where in Canada they hire, Monsanto hires Robinson investigation, who hire ex-Royal Canadian Mounted Police to police their contracts. Do we need this in a free society? Do we need this in a democratic society where we now have a new police force to police Monsanto's contract? A spy network, whatever you want to call it, where they advertise to squeal or rat or inform on your neighbors if you think they might be growing GMO canola without a license. And I think that after Monsanto receives a report maybe from a farmer that his neighbor might be growing it, and you get a couple of police officers or former police officers of Monsanto come out to your farm and they intimidate and harass this farmer and say, we have this report, if you don't come clean, we'll get you, and by the time we're through with you, we'll destroy you. But that leads into something else. It leads into the social fabric, the breakdown of the social fabric of our rural communities, where you're pitting farmer against farmer. If a farmer gets a visit from Monsanto's police, and after they leave, what do you think that farmer thinks? Was it this neighbor or that neighbor? So the working together of farmers cooperating together is breaking down. It's a rule, the divide and conquer. We don't need this. I'm a third-generation farmer, and our country and your country has been built up by people working together. Now we're having that social fabric being broken down by Monsanto's policy. To me, this is one of the worst things that could happen. Then you have the issue of what farmers call extortion letters, where Monsanto, if they can't find a farmer, or Monsanto's police can't find a farmer at home, they send out these extortion letters. And in it says, we have reason to believe you might be growing it. We assess it so many acres, and normally the fine is $125 an acre. I have letters here, some for, this one is $28,000. I have one for $125,000, another one for $50,000. Can you imagine the fear that goes into a farmer when he receives a letter like this? How can an average individual like myself or any farmer stand up to a multi-billion-dollar corporation? To give you an example, this is going into 4 years that my wife and I are fighting Monsanto. Our legal bills, just my lawyer, is over $200,000. My appeal has been around $60-some thousand. I just filed another appeal because Monsanto came after me again in November and said they want all their court costs paid of $1 million. So we're appealing that. Where is the justice for an average person to fight a multinational? So most farmers just give in and say, what can we do? We don't want to go to court, and they'll pay whatever fine that Monsanto wants. So that's the other issue, the liability issue. And then you have the contract that Monsanto gets farmers to sign. And believe me, it's unbelievable how many farmers have signed this contract without even reading it. And it gives up the right to use your own seed. They have to buy the chemicals from Monsanto. They have to allow Monsanto's police to come on your land for 3 years after you sign this contract. So those are the issues that is happening and not what could happen. So what does it really all mean? It means the sale of more chemicals by multinationals such as Monsanto. It doesn't mean an increase in wheat or in canola, in soybeans. And soybeans, there's figures out now, it's a 15% less in yield. It doesn't mean a better quality. In fact, you never ever hear Monsanto say about quality. The quality of canola, I would say, has dropped by 1/3 due to the increase of greens, which means a higher uric acid in the canola. So basically, it's a suppression of people's rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and it really means more money. It's greed, it's power, and it's control, and it's said suppression of people's rights. And in the end, to sell more chemicals. One thing I never really talk about, and I'm going to talk about it today for a few minutes, and it's the stress. It's not easy for my wife and myself to stand up to a multinational. The threats, the fears, the intimidation that we received. In South Africa, when I spoke at the legislature, and I came out of the legislature in Cape Town, Monsanto's rep came up to me and said, nobody stands up to Monsanto We're going to get you, and we're going to destroy you, and when you get back to Canada, we're going to make big trouble for you. So these are the situation that my wife and I are living under. And it's not, like I said, only my wife and myself. It's our family. It's our neighbors who are very concerned. Because my neighbors have been told this. If you even support Percy, we're going to do to you what we're doing to him. It's come to a point of such fear. Phone calls. They stalk us for days and days at a time. They'll park their vehicles a block or half a block from our house and watch us. All day long they'll park alongside of our land and watch us, stalk us. And when we go to the police and say, or complain about it, there's nothing done, because the people that are doing are former RCMP, and they don't want to lay charges against their former colleagues. It got so bad in 1999 and 2000 and the end of the year 2000, my hired man or myself never went into a combine, we never went into a tractor unless we had a rifle with us. Can you imagine what that is like, to live in fear like that? So this is some of the issue that is happening in a free society in Canada and the United States. Now, there are many things I could talk about, because the whole issue of patenting life-giving forms, when is it a discovery and when is it an invention? So that whole issue in my case also has to be addressed. Where does my case stand right now? In May, the Court of Appeal, Federal Court of Canada Appeal, heard my case, and we're waiting for the judgment, which could take 2 months, 6 months, it could take a year. But people feel, legal people feel, it will not stop there. It will ultimately go to the Supreme Court of Canada. And so that whole issue, patenting of life-giving forms, because once you put a life-giving form into the environment, remember, there is no calling back. It is there forever. We will never ever get rid of the new superweed canola in Western Canada. It's there forever. So my choice has been taken away, and what I have been also telling farmers around the world is never, never give up their right to be able to use their own seed. They should fight and fight hard to or never sign a contract giving up that right. And if they do, or any farmer does that, you'll become a serf of the land and we'll go back to a feudal system. Our rights and our freedom will be gone, because you will be told what seed you can get, who gets it, what chemicals you can use, total control and domination. Many times, and my wife and I, in closing, my wife and I feel, has it been worth 4 years of fighting and standing up to what we believe in? And we say, yes, it has been worth everything to stand up for the rights and freedom of not only farmers, but everyone. And I look at food security, food safety, and I'm concerned about the food that we are feeding to our children and our grandchildren. And I think in closing, I'd like to say this, that I want to leave a legacy to my children and to my grandchildren, and I have 5 children and 14 grandchildren, of land and food, not with poisons, but land and food without poisons. That is why I'm here today, to bring you that message, and to the younger generation, never give up your rights and fight hard. Thank you very much.
And I'm with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. I work on a program for globalism and global governance. IATP has a number of programs. based in Minneapolis. We have a forestry program that works on forestry certification projects. And in my section, we work on global water issues, biotechnology and genetic resources. And also we have more local and regional facets of our organization that work on environment and agriculture, trade in agriculture and the WTO, and industrial aquacultural systems, which also includes GMOs and patents. And we have a Windustry program to increase the adoption of wind energy on farms. We have a new eco-labeling program to market eco-friendly products. And generally, I guess, and we have a kind of a large, kind of vast internet resources, many websites, the Trade Observatory. And if you want to take a look at these, they're all kind of just spelled out in that way: tradeobservatory.org, waterobservatory.org, agobservatory.org, and soon we'll be launching the globalobservatory.org. And these will be kind of our featured websites that centralize all these issues. I gotta tell you, patents on life really make my blood boil. And when I hear Percy talk about the tactics of intimidation and think about the way that the U.S. government represents our interests internationally, I can't be, it gets my heart just pounding. And it's not that I'm nervous, it's that I feel so passionately that we're going in absolutely the wrong direction. At least our government and many of the governments of the world are taking us in just a disastrous direction. I'm going to talk about a few things in the ways that patents affect ecosystems. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is how nature abhors a monoculture, and that it greatly increases the risk of disease. I'm going to talk a little bit about wild rice and the work that the Institute's been doing with Native American tribes on stopping the patenting of wild rice and the commodification of wild rice as an indigenous resource. I'll talk a little bit about increased persistence of pesticides and insecticides in the environment, and also negative effects on beneficial organisms. And then finally, I'd like to refer to you or tell you about my experience with the U.S. government and the U.S. State Department and how they're representing our ideals internationally. And if that's okay with you all. You know, I don't want to scare you here, but as Percy was talking about testing sites and test plots, and that it's the only purpose of those test plots is to intentionally contaminate the environment. And you know what John Ashcroft just said last week? Apparently, during the Biotechnology Industry Organization, the overarching kind of PR organization for the biotech industry in Toronto, announced that they're going to be Epicite is producing a spermicide corn, and maybe you've heard about this. It's a corn that produces a kind of a spermicide for men, that if you eat the corn, you'll become sterile. And John Ashcroft went on record as saying that let's contaminate the entire corn supply for Africa. It'll solve all our problems. This is, I mean, you could suppose that that John Ashcroft was a racist person, but to be just so straight up racist in a public way to say let's eliminate the African people with this new corn product. And all across the United States and Canada, there's experimental varieties that boggle the mind. In Minnesota alone, there's experimental varieties that have so-called multiple phenotypes. Now they're intentionally increasing multiple herbicide resistant. It's not just an accident anymore in the case of canola. They're breeding into and openly testing in fields crops that have 4 or 5 different kinds of herbicide and insecticide resistance, novel proteins, whatever that means, industrial enzymes. And in some states, in Iowa and other places, they're testing pharmaceuticals, hepatitis, in corn, and a number of different diseases. And they're openly blowing around in the wind. Even, you know, the plots test size are 5 to 60 acres generally. But and the public interest, the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, as they did last year, will be releasing a report that covers all of these issues and summarizes the testing plots. But you know, it's getting increasingly scary. The result of which is going to be that since the United States, which I'm sure Craig will talk about, has no labeling or traceability requirements like Europe or other countries, that here we will have low levels throughout the United States in all kinds of crops. We will have low levels of antibiotics, diseases, and all kinds of pesticides and poisons bred into the crops in varying levels that we cannot monitor. So keeping these things in mind, I'm going to start talking about how nature abhors a monoculture. And first off, with the Irish potato famine, that occurred as a result of the fact that the English more or less forced the Irish farmers to grow mainly one, but about 3 kinds of potatoes that the English people preferred to eat. And what happened as a result of that is a blight came through and destroyed the vast majority of the potato crop, and many people died as a result of famine. I think we have to think about this, and when we're planting monoculture crops, that it greatly enhances the risk of disease. Diseases, attempting to get rid of the corn borer and some of these other diseases, they're there for a reason. You know, when humans make the poor decision of planting one particular kind of crop everywhere, nature says, no way, I'm not letting this happen, and there's going to be a disease that's going to wipe out a good part of your crop because that's what I do. That's what nature does, is restores the balance. And that's what diseases do, is nature's way of attempting to restore the balance. And so here we are trying to constantly create disease-resistant plants, pesticide, herbicide-resistant plants, and we're not working with nature when early plant breeders with a very purposefully developed many different varieties that exhibited all kinds of characteristics that were resistant to various diseases. So they could always rely on the fact that if there was a certain disease or pest coming through, or there was a drought, or the conditions were wet, or whatever the conditions might have been, that they would have some kind of food. And so we're absolutely reducing the possibility of living in a sustainable way by almost assuredly increasing our risks of disease and famine around the world. This relates to patents in that, and I'll talk about wild rice as one of the main examples. Patents, it became the Anishinaabe, which is the ricing culture, the different tribes of Native Americans, the Leech Lake, the Ojibwe, the White Earth Indian Reservation in Minnesota. They came to learn in 1998 that the University of Minnesota was doing genomic research on wild rice, that they were attempting to decode the genome. And they also became aware that NorCal, a country in Northern California, had patented and received a patent on cytoplasmic male sterility, which is a kind of a bull patent that corporations commonly use to patent indigenous resources and medicinal products, herbs. What cytoplasmic male sterility means is eliminating the ability of a plant to produce male pollen, so the plant just produces female pollen, and thus you have to reseed it every year. So the White Earth Indian Reservation and the Chippewa, they wrote a letter to the president of the university several years ago demanding information. What are you doing to our wild rice? Wild rice has been it's part of their spiritual and cultural message. They were told by their creator that you will go to the place where the food grows on the water, and then that you will call your home. And so it has of great spiritual significance that they were not, none of the Native Americans were in any way consulted on the kind of research that the university has been doing since the 1960s, in fact, and earlier on developing hybrids of wild rice. And right in the center of biodiversity of wild rice, you have a class at the university. Some interested professors told that became involved with the Native Americans, and they had a class on wild rice, and the point of the class was to go through all the issues, to meet with Native American peoples, and to look at what the university was doing, and to come up with suggestions. And at the end of the course, they came up with a letter and sent it to the University of Minnesota President Mark Yudof, and the president has never in any substantive way responded to the concerns of the class, which basically asked the university to suspend all genomic research of wild rice until there is significant collaboration with the Native Americans, to involve Native Americans in all dialogue in what's happening with wild rice and other indigenous resources. And here we are today. We recently had a press conference in Raleigh where basically all Native American tribes from Minnesota and northern Wisconsin and Canada came together to a meeting of the biotech industry at the university, and made a proclamation, demanded that you must stop this genetic modification or attempts to genetically modify wild rice. And the university has said, we'll give you the information, but they still haven't been forthcoming. And I think one of the reasons why wild rice is really critical of this whole patenting of life is that it's not, wild rice is kind of a misnomer. It's called monomen. It's the Native Americans have been caretakers of it for thousands of years, and while they have inbred it in the way that United States industrial agriculture would define, they've seeded lakes over thousands of years and protected it and have their practices, cultural practices, a way to process it, and this is all in jeopardy. Even with the creation of hybrids, just the creation of hybrids alone, and the patenting of the cytoplasmic male sterility, and also they have increased shattering time. So what that does is it allows the rice to break open easily, so it all falls to the ground. And then they also try to make it ripen at the same time, so they can just come in there with an airboat and harvest it all at one time, instead of in the traditional way where they go around the lake and they harvest in the sunniest spots first, and then some of the rice stays in the lake and it reseeds itself. And so, you know, this research station like I'm talking about is right in the center of biodiversity. You have ducks eating the rice, and this hybridized rice, and you have other animals transferring it to other lakes, to native stands. And what happens is that rice gets seeded, and it doesn't have, you know, it's bred to be able to in water to germinate in a certain amount of water. It's bred to have all these standardized characteristics, and when it gets in the wild populations that have great variability, great genetic variability, where they're there to, like, say if there's a huge amount of snowfall, they can adapt. If there's a drought conditions, they can adapt. So it's eliminating the possibility of a wild rice to adapt to its natural environment, and will make it go extinct. And patents are one of the main instigators of these kind of developments. They wouldn't, you know, the wild rice industry in California wouldn't be putting all kinds of money towards this if they didn't have a relative assurance that the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office was going to give them the patent, give them the 20-year monopoly rights to produce, you know, their hybrids. Or it doesn't even have to be genetically modified. It can just be hybrids nowadays. They're patenting now, since this, if you look at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office website, they're patenting everything. It's not just genetically modified stuff. The Pioneer JEM Ag case gave them both the authority and the incentive to patent literally everything, you know. And so you know, there's obviously serious environmental and ecosystem devastating effects that happens from these things. Another one of them is 3 minutes. Okay. Another one of them is the impact on the beneficial insects, on the soil ecology in general. Just common sense will tell you that the patented Roundup Ready and different Roundup Ready and other insecticide resistant varieties, they'll be you have in the actual stalk of the plant, and the soybeans or the BT or whatever, it increases pesticide resistance. It kills non-target species like the ladybug, was so integral to you know, successful crops. It kills microorganisms in the soil and kind of destroys the whole soil ecology, you know, and persists there for a very long time. I mean, if you can imagine that it's in the stalk of the plant, that it takes a while for the stalk of a corn plant to degrade, and then it's kind of like a slow release aspirin or something that takes a while to degrade in your stomach. It slowly leaks out poison into the environment over a number of years. Well, so I have a short time left here. Patents have severely negatively impacted our environments. We have this serious monoculture that opens us up for disaster. We have the United States State Department, which, that doesn't represent any of our viewpoints. I've been to the Convention on Biological Diversity meetings and in The Hague just recently, and I'm trying to represent the interests of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, which is sustainable farms and communities, and also trying to, if the Farmers Union isn't there, trying to represent their interests as well. The National Farmers Union, would be against, these technology agreements and against the patenting of life, and they've come out against it. Then you have the U.S. State Department, which won't listen to anybody, that any of us, any of the viewpoints that we're presenting. And even though the U.S. isn't a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity or the Biosafety Protocol, which is attempting to establish these liability, international liability regimes, they do put great resources into undermining them. They have some of the biggest delegations of any country working full-time to undermine the environment of farmers and to wholeheartedly support the interests of corporations. And it's so funny that this one State Department woman she had told me personally, I voted for Paul Wellstone, one of the more progressive senators here in the United States. And then here she is, completely and utterly representing the interests of corporations. I don't know how, I couldn't personally imagine going so much against my own values as to destroy the rights of farmers internationally. I couldn't live with myself for doing that. But here you have this young woman very succinctly eroding the rights of farmers and our rights to protect our ecosystem in an international way. And it's very insidious, and the U.S. State Department, under the leadership of the Bush administration, is doing this in every possible forum. And the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations at the World Food Summit, and here at the G8, we have the opportunity to come together to fight against the contamination and the destruction of our ecosystems, and I hope the things I've told to you today and the things that you learn you can take with you and use in a practical way of protecting our rights as humanity in a globe to create a sustainable future for it all. Thank you very much.
First thing I want to do is reintroduce myself. My name is Stephen Jones. I'm a public servant. I take that title very seriously. What I want to do this morning is basically give an introduction to the panel discussion that we'll be having after lunch. And on that panel will be Bill Tracy, sweet corn breeder from University of Wisconsin, and J.J. Hoppala, who's in the back row there now, is involved in the Oregon Tilt, and he's the director of the Farmers Cooperative Genome Project, which is a very interesting and very good project that's going on. I'm housed at a land-grant university. I'm housed at Washington State University. I want to sort of define the land-grant mission very quickly. and then give an overview of what my wheat breeding program is at Washington State University, how wheat works in general in this country in terms of varieties and things like that. I then want to talk about some of the dangers and problems that I see as land-grant universities become more and more privatized and adapt a business model. I then want to spend some time quickly on some very easy solutions to combating the privatization of the land-grant universities. And again, we'll have a lot of time this afternoon to discuss these issues as well. Where did the land grants come from and where are they now? They were started in 1862. Congress passed an act called the Land Grant Act. President Lincoln signed it. We were in the Civil War at that time. I'll just read a one-sentence quote from Abraham Lincoln as he signed the Land Grant Act of 1862. He said, "The land-grant university system is being built on behalf of the people who have invested in these public universities their hopes, their support, and their confidence." It's a very simple statement. It's a very powerful statement. It's also a statement that's in jeopardy today at our land-grant universities. Where are the land-grant universities here in this state? It's Montana State University. Within driving distance of Missoula, you have Montana State University, you have Utah State University, University of Idaho, Washington State University, Oregon State University, University of Wyoming. I'm not sure if the Dakotas are a day's drive from here or not, but South Dakota State, North Dakota State, a little further down south, University of California, Berkeley, and Davis are the land-grant institutions there. Basically, every state has a land-grant university. Basically, they were set up mostly finalized in the late 1800s to provide support for the mechanical and agricultural arts to help rural communities. And home economics, that's right. So the position that I hold at Washington State University was started in 1894. The first winter wheat breeder received a position at WSU July 1st, 1894. There were 7 faculty on campus. We had a president and 7 faculty. Something we didn't have was a football coach. Something we had was a football team. We hadn't played a game yet, but we were scheduled to play University of Idaho on November 10th of 1894. The new wheat breeder was one of the last faculty of that first group to be hired, so he was chosen to coach the football team. Problem was, he knew nothing about football. Literally had never played it. He had a PhD in mathematics. He was born during the Civil War, by the way. So the president at that time said, "You're a wheat breeder, you don't have much to do, you're going to coach football." He took the train up to Spokane, bought a book on how to coach football, and they beat the University of Idaho 10-0. They then went undefeated for the first 3 years of the existence of Washington State University. You might ask, what was this football coach, wheat breeder paid? He was paid $0 to coach football. Our coach now makes about $500,000. They haven't had an undefeated season since. Times have changed. Times have changed in some sort of fluffy ways, and they've changed in some very serious ways. So the program that I had has been in existence for 108 years. The first 100 years, maybe a little more than that, were pretty simple. The job was to produce varieties for the growers of the state of Washington and the Pacific Northwest. The program has been very successful. The programs are still successful. If we look at all the land grants in the northwestern United States, about 90% of the wheat grown is out of these universities. It's still given freely to the farmers in these states. Nationwide, the majority of the wheat grown in this country comes out of land-grant universities still. There's about over 60 million acres of wheat in the country. Most of it is still given away freely. I produce varieties, I turn them over to seed dealers, and they sell them for a fairly nominal fee, but there's no strings attached. That's changing, and that's changing very quickly. It's not an exaggeration to say that every land-grant university in this country that has a wheat breeding program has confidential agreements with Monsanto and BASF to introduce herbicide resistance into the land-grant wheats. That's done because the land grants are the institutions, the breeding programs that have the wheat. Monsanto does not have a wheat breeding program. We do. We, in terms of society, in our land grant institutions, we have wheat, and we have the varieties. Again, in the Northwest, about 90% of the wheat being grown comes out of the land grant universities. What's going to change very shortly is that the wheat that was once free is now going to be sold back to the farmers that paid to produce these wheats in the first place. They will have a single gene inserted to them. The growers will be forced to buy seed every year. They will be forced to pay twice for the varieties that they help produce through programs such as mine. I see that as a problem. We heard a lot about patents this morning. Patents out of universities are very illustrative of what's going on at the land grant universities. In 1980, there were less than 100 patents submitted and granted to universities in this country, less than 100. 1990, there were 1,000. Okay, that's per year. So in 1990, there were 1,000 new ones. 1998, 3,500 new ones. Again, this is universities nationwide. 99, 7,000. Doubled in 1 year. 2000, the results are not yet complete, but it's well over 10,000 patents coming out of universities. The danger that I see in that, the dangers are several. One is the direction of our research. Are we moving towards questions that only have proprietary answers? Do we want to control our weeds only from ways that we can control the genes and sell the genes back to growers? Are we asking questions that only have proprietary answers? Is a very good question to ask your public university. Who decides the direction of our research? Is it the growers, like it was for the first 104 years of my program? Is it society? Is there a distinction between what's good for the farmer and what's good for society? In the past, there hasn't been. Today, we're moving in that direction. Society doesn't want GMOs, the farmers do. What does a public breeder do? How do you decide that? Germplasm exchange is in dire jeopardy right now. Wheat is not native to Montana. It is not native to Washington State or Canada or the United States. It's native to the Middle East. Wheat is an introduced crop. All of the genes that we've used in the past 108 years in my program have been introduced genes from Turkey, from Japan, from Syria, from Jordan, from Russia, from Kenya, from Ethiopia. These genes were exchanged freely the first 100 years. They're not today. Today they're unobtainable. Today they're unobtainable in essence between Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and Montana. Forget the other countries. Germplasm exchange is how we've made progress in breeding programs. It's in dire jeopardy right now. The exchange of ideas and genes and publications and students is in dire straits right now. We're having a hard time exchanging ideas if someone owns them. We're having a hard time exchanging genes if someone owns them. If the direction of our research is being controlled by private enterprise, so is our publication. There are delays to publish. There is no publish on some things, certainly if it jeopardizes a patent application. Traditionally, land grants have done what industry has ignored. That's not true anymore. So our mission was to do what industry was not doing. We were unique. We had our own direction and mission. Now we're duplicating and partnering with industry. Another danger or problem that I see with the land grant universities is we're asking who benefits from our research. If you have to ask who benefits from the research at a public institution, then you're in trouble. So what are some solutions? The first solution, and we heard it several times this morning, is no patents on life. No patents on existing DNA sequences. It's a very simple solution that, as we heard several times this morning, that shuts down the whole system. It really does. The arguments are, we put so much money into this, we should get something back. Okay? If that's true, then give it back to the farmer and give it back to the public. In my program, we put 108 years into these varieties. Wheat farmers on this planet have put 10,000 years into improving this crop. Okay, that's worth a lot more than a single herbicide gene, right? What's a gene for herbicide resistance worth? 0. What's it worth in a wheat plant? $5 to $50 an acre. Okay, it's as simple as that. Who owns that wheat plant? Who should own it? It's very difficult when you look at the pedigree and the heritage of what's gone into this material. The argument is we can't make progress without patents. We made it out of the dark ages without patents, right? I think that's a powerful point. Another solution is a very simple one. Let's get the corporations out of our public schools. You would be surprised if you're not in a land grant setting how far they are into our system. I don't think they should be there. I believe in the separation of church and state. I believe in the separation of corporation and state as well. It's designed that way. It worked very well. It's going down right now because of the corporations affecting the direction of our research. Repeal the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act was passed in 1980. Several acts were passed after that. That allows public scientists, both in the USDA, federal government, and in state situations, to profit from their inventions. The idea there was the beginning of the privatization and the business model in public research settings. We need to be competitive with business. We need to do just like they do. We need to patent our discoveries, and we need to pay our scientists for doing such a good job. Okay, I'm paid once. I don't need to be paid twice. If I were to put Roundup resistance into Washington State varieties, I would get, on average, 30% of those royalties back to me personally. That's an important point. The split is usually 30% to the transfer office or the intellectual property office, a third would go to the college or departments, and a third goes to the inventor or the scientist directly. That's a very important point. Of these 10,000 patents that were granted to universities in 2000, you're talking about 10,000 events that money can be going back to the inventor. And these inventors are public servants. Okay. I find that very distasteful, and I can't believe that exists. That started with the Bayh-Dole Act. There were several after that. The argument there is the same one, that it's going to help competition. It's going to make us be like business. So we need to be more like business. Another solution is that universities should admit what is good for industry may not necessarily further the social good. That's a very obvious one. That's one that we rarely, if ever, hear in a university setting. And that is that what's good for industry is good for society, right? That's the argument. I, for one, am tired of being trickled on from the trickle-down theory. I think at the university we should remove our unbiased status and you should make us earn it back. That if you want to say I'm biased, that's fine. Let me prove to you that I'm not. We read op-eds, we see TV interviews, we hear radio interviews of university scientists that are profiting from what they're preaching and profiting from what they're promoting. They're profiting from the Bayh-Dole Act and other acts, and they're promoting an industry. And these people should not have an unbiased status. It's obvious, and it's a very powerful one. I would be all for taking it away from all of us and making us earn it back individually. I've never received a penny from industry. I never will. Okay. I think as a society, we need to reject the phrase sound science. okay? I hear that daily in support of this industry. Sound science. We need to base everything on sound science. It was not that long ago that the person that decided what sound science was the Pope. Okay? That phrase is used to remove society from the argument, right? You can't decide if this is good or safe because you don't understand sound science or you're not using sound science. Very dangerous phrase to use in science is the determination of sound science. It's a throwaway phrase, and it is used, like I said, I hear that at least once a day. We need to increase society's role in the land-grant universities. Land grants are very sensitive to legislators. They're very sensitive to what they call their stakeholders. If the stakeholders that are the loudest are the industry, that's who they listen to. If these people have money, they listen to them even more. Society, if they think the land grants are worth saving, and that's what we'll be talking about in the panel discussion to some degree, if you agree that these institutions are worth saving, then you need to worry about some of the solutions or come up with some of your own solutions in this. Okay, and that's it. So, is that it? How many? 3. Okay, I thought it was 0. I think I'll wrap it up there. Anyway, again, we have our panel at 1 o'clock, and I would encourage you to come to that. We could have some good discussion. I thank you for coming to this meeting. I thank you for inviting me to this meeting as well. Thank you.
Thoughts that I would like to just share has to do with the institutional framework, global framework that governs industrial agriculture. I think the World Trade Organization, specifically through its agreement, the Agreement on Agriculture, now provides a governance structure and a set of rules that promotes globally the interests of industrial agriculture, especially that based in the North. Let me just say that we should not underestimate the significance of the Agreement on Agriculture. For those of us in the South, the AOA, as we call it, is a very great threat to the existence of small farmers. In the North, we often don't hear about the Agreement on Agriculture because I think it is in the interests of the big agricultural interests, both in the European Union and the United States, to keep it below the radar screen. But throughout the world, in gatherings like those that have been provoked by the World Trade Organization, the AOA and the controversy over the AOA is on the forefront. I just wanted to just briefly go through why this is such a threat to farmers and smallholder agriculture in the South. I think it is important to point out that the agriculture was not incorporated into the governance, into the structure of the World Trade Organization until very recently, in 1995. And for a long, long time, agriculture was basically not governed by a common set of rules, agricultural trade. And a lot of the reason for this was in the early 1950s, the United States threatened to walk out of what was then the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs if it was not allowed to take advantage of a waiver and impose protective tariffs on dairy and other agricultural products that were entering the United States and that were perceived to be a threat to the interests of the dairy industry and other agricultural interests in the U.S. And because of that, what we had is the European Union also began to take advantage of the waiver from protective tariffs. And this expanded to, in fact, taking advantage of the waiver from subsidies, so that both the United States and the European Union, effectively speaking, because of this global competition that they had, both effectively sidelined the GATT when it came to agriculture. Now, what happened here, of course, is that once you have big agricultural interests that are massively subsidized in both the United States and the European Union, what we had was the growth of extremely competitive interests, but what we might call monopolistic competition on a global level. Basically, this system of subsidies, in the case of the European Union, gave rise to an agricultural system that needed surplus markets. Basically, because the system of subsidies was so enormous and so massive, it just encouraged overproduction. And when you have a situation of overproduction, you therefore needed third country markets. And the United States, of course, kept up with the European Union in terms of the subsidization. And I think we need not mention here the fact that it was mainly big agricultural interests in both the EU and the United States that benefited from this. What we then had was an extremely destructive situation. It wasn't destructive for the EU and the US agricultural interests. It was destructive for the farmers in third countries, and particularly in third world countries, like beef farmers in South Africa and in Southwest Africa, where the European Union just dumped very low-priced beef, and low-priced beef precisely because it was subsidized. And what we saw then happening up to the early 90s was that global prices were thoroughly skewed. There was no such thing as a free market in agriculture, because in terms of global agriculture, what you had was all the prices were skewed by tremendous subsidization, both on the part of the EU and the United States. And what you had, therefore, was that, of course, with highly subsidized products hitting third country markets, the small farmers, grain farmers, corn farmers, rice farmers, beef raisers, just could not compete with the subsidized prices, and it was just hell for our farmers in the South. Nevertheless, they came up with the agreement on agriculture. The United States and the European Union finally decided that the competition for third country markets was getting out of hand. They needed some rules of engagement, okay? But these were the rules of engagement that were then institutionalized in the AOA. So it wasn't so much to bring about the free market in agriculture, which is supposed to be the ideology of the World Trade Organization. It was really to adopt a system of monopolistic competition between these two great agricultural superpowers. The free market in agricultural trade was not a consideration at all in terms of the creation of the AOA. And this is what's interesting about the WTO, because its ideology is free trade, and yet the centerpiece of the WTO, which is the agricultural agreement and the trade-related intellectual property rights, protects monopoly. Okay? So it's a very interesting agreement that basically is free trade and free market in some aspects, but in many real dimensions, and in the most important ones, protects monopolistic interests in the EU and the United States. So, the long and short of it is, what were the new rules of engagement? The whole idea was that the so-called level of overall subsidization would be brought down, but not eliminated. That export subsidies on the part of the EU and the United States would also be brought down, but not eliminated. And that there would be a greater degree of market access within the EU and the United States and other developed countries. But there would, of course, be also the developing countries would have to also provide market access to the products from the north. And there were a whole lots of exceptions, like the so-called green box within the WTO, that basically what it does is direct income payments. And as we all know, in the United States and in Europe, direct income payments to agricultural interests are necessary for survival in both the EU and the US. Without direct income payments, which now constitutes about one-fourth to one-third of the income of farmers in both the EU and the United States, agriculture would not be a paying occupation in these countries. I think direct income payments and the whole system of subsidies really shows that agricultural production in the United States and Europe is a socialized enterprise. If we say it's a socialized enterprise, meaning that the state provides so much of the resources that it practically is the linchpin of the whole system. So behind this free market ideology that so many people talk about in the United States, we have a socialist agriculture in these countries. But of course, the beneficiaries, it still, of course, goes to private interests. And yet it is the state that provides from public citizens' money, okay, from you and me, you know, the wherewithal to keep agriculture alive. In the third world countries, no. We do not have any subsidies, okay? There is completely the small farmer lives by the market. So this is the terrible dual standards that we have in global agricultural trade, in that here in the United States and in Europe, it's socialism and socialist production and private appropriation. For us in the third world, it's strictly the free market. Okay? No subsidies. Let me just quickly go through what has been the results of the AOA. Well, the results of the AOA has been that the level of agricultural subsidization in 1995 was $182 billion. The level of subsidization today now reaches among the rich agricultural trading powers, something like around $400 billion. So in other words, the agreement on agriculture has in fact intensified subsidization, and the aggregate measure of support has definitely gone up. I think that it's become quite disgraceful. During the last Doha ministerial meeting, the European Union basically said, despite the fact that the AOA commits us to phasing out export subsidies, we will not phase out export subsidies. And they got that into the declaration, I mean that in certain wording. The United States, for its part, has also matched the European Union. We just had the Bush administration basically announced that it was going to enact this farm bill of about, is it $200 million farm bill? You know, all the levels of emergency relief subsidies that will go to the farming sector, despite the fact that the United States has committed itself to supposedly bringing down subsidies when it signed on to the AOA in 1995. Basically, the level of subsidization has just been going up. Now, the The victims of all this, and I would just like to reiterate, is, again, the third world developing countries. Because there is no protection, there is no subsidization, but we have eliminated our quotas because the WTO tells us you cannot keep quotas, okay? And we have converted quotas into tariffs, but there has also been commitments that our countries have made, governments, not farmers, that would bring down those tariffs over time. So in country after country at this point, what we're seeing is the crisis of smallholder agriculture. In my country, the Philippines, it no longer pays to be a corn farmer because there's so much cheap American corn coming in. It no longer pays to be a rice farmer because there's so much cheap Thai and US rice coming in. Our poultry, chicken parts industry was killed in about 3 years between 1997 and 2000 because the United States basically said, you have to eliminate, according to the WTO, you guys have to eliminate these quotas that you have imposed on chicken parts coming in. And because it's a weak government, it gave in, and within 3 years our chicken parts industry was gone. A very close friend of mine, for instance, who was at first making a go of a business of poultry raising on organic, along organic lines, about 6 months ago just gave up because it was just not possible to compete with the chicken coming in from the United States. So multiply this incidence by 1 million times, and one can realize, what a massive, terrible impact the agreement on agriculture has had on our countries. So, however, the resistance has increased. Via Campesina, a whole lot of networks of third world smallholding farmers have brought up and increasingly pushed the demand that we should get agriculture out of the World Trade Organization. That, of course, I think that everything else should be taken out of the World Trade Organization, but I think agriculture should be the first to be taken out because agriculture is an economic activity, of course, but it is more than just an economic activity. It is a culture, it is a way of life, it is a basis of politics, it is something, that cannot be commodified. And I think people are beginning to realize this both north and south. In the north, it is the vast majority of small farmers who have been squeezed by corporate interests and who do not enjoy any of the subsidization. I think in the European Union too, the small farmers who realize the same thing, that it is the big ones that have been squeezing them and benefit from tremendous state subsidies. And I think these linkages, alliances of farmers across north and south with organizations like Via Campesina is beginning to bear fruit. And we've seen this. Farmers' lobbies, farmer groups have been very prominent in Seattle. Okay, I just wanted to give you an instance of one of the leaders of the Forum of the Poor, which is a farmers' organization in Thailand. He went back to Thailand and he was interviewed by the press. And Thais usually are very, reserved people. And one of the first things that this very reserved man said is that I was in Seattle, and I'm very proud to tell you that I was one of the people who tried to set fire to the McDonald's. And in Genoa and in Chiang Mai, in meeting after meeting, the farmers' voice, the demand of small farmers to get agriculture out of the WTO, or the WTO out of agriculture, that is an escalating demand at this point. So let me just end there by saying that I think that the interests of people here, the interests of consumers, the interests of farmers, I think this is all the same, okay? And this is now, I think, one of the things that unite all of us is the realization that industrial agriculture is bad for everybody except a few corporate interests, and that the WTO is now becoming one of the main pillars of protection of industrial agriculture. That is also why the World Trade Organization has to go, and if it can't go, then we must really reduce its power. And among the first things we must do to reduce its power is to get agriculture out of the WTO. Thank you.